Krishna Parabrahmane Namaha. Today the topic is epistemology. It's a peculiar word. I mean, the science of knowledge. That's Jnana Shastrani. Epistemology is called. Let us have detail after the prayer. Namaste Deva Devesha Pradhanaya Namo Namaha Pruthivyam Gandharupena Samstitah Praninam Hare. How can we come across to know the self? The answer is that if we truly know anything at all, it is the self. And everything else we seem to know is a product of avidya or nescience, which splits up the pure or integral knowledge into subject and object. For if the self is universal and is the only reality, then it is not the real that calls for explanation, but the false, the erroneous and the unreal. Why should avidya exist at all? Is it ingrained in the self? If so, the non-dualist concept of the self would be destroyed. If it were altogether outside the self, it would have to bear some relationship to the self. As we saw in the last chapter, is unreal. Before we can get any further with answering these questions and understanding the nature of avidya itself, we must look at samskara's analysis of the antakarana and the part that it plays in the perceptive process through which we derive our empirical knowledge. In Western terminology, we must consider his theory of psychology. Here we encounter a fresh difficulty in the exposition of his philosophy. As we have said before, in talking of the self, we are trying to explain something which by its very nature cannot be split up into bits and explained, but can only be intuitively grasped as a whole. Shankara had to deal with this difficulty in teaching his philosophy among the intellectual philosophies of his own day. In his analysis of Antakarana, he was dealing not with a spiritual entity, but with what we may for a moment loosely call the mind. He was in the territory which he was in the school of philosopher did and still do rightly regard as part of their province, and he was compelled to take notice of the theories of his time. This makes much of what follows deceptively familiar to the student of Western philosophy and makes it essential for him not to forget two important things. 1. The propositions are intended to be no more than a counterpart on the intellectual plane to Shankara's whole view of life. Any similarity between them and the views of Hume, for example, is coincidental. Hume just happened to hit on the same argument 1,000 years later in the same limited context. In other respects, the views of Hume and Shankara would not have regarded. Shankara are on different plans. The arguments themselves as proving anything particularly valid. He was aware of the limitations of this sort of reasoning, and no doubt, with the clear insight of a liberated sage, he felt in his bones that the arguments are to some extent circular. He produced them to meet the challenge of intellectual philosophers. We must therefore warn the student that he will not get any nearer to the essence of Shankara's philosophy by analyzing, criticizing, and constructing the arguments set out in the later part of this chapter. The Antakarana is, so to say, the material mind, and it is the seed not only the intellectual processes but also of feelings. It is not, however, a kind of sense organ because it has on its own level a direct perception of itself and its own changes. The senses are the tools by which the Antakarana apprehends objects. If it is not in a state of attention, the senses do not function. We may have a thing in front of our eyes and still not see it. We aptly say, "My mind was somewhere else." The Antakarana is neither infinitely large nor infinitesimally small. It is usually thought of pervading the body and thus being about the same size. Not gross and solid like ordinary matter, but an ethereal, transparent, shining thing in which objects are manifested as it were in a mirror. This power of the Antakarana is not, however, inherent in it. It gains this power through its association with the self. In the self, we live and move and have our being. In another metaphor, the self is reflected in the ethereal element of the Antakarana and, like the sun, reveals the entire world of matter. These metaphors are at best merely rough indications of what is intended. The exact nature of the interaction between the self and the Antakarana cannot be expressed in words. An example in which a similar difficulty occurs but is calmly accepted can be found in music. As a matter of scientific fact, the vibrations per second of a higher note of a perfect fifth are exactly 1.5 times those of the lower note. From the strictly musical point of view, the essential thing is that the fifth has a characteristic bare sound which every person with a reasonably musical ear can recognize. Now, the knowledge that the two notes were separated by a perfect fifth could be obtained by a musician if he were also physicist, by measuring the rate of vibrations of the two sounds separately and comparing them. The musician can, however, tell by ear alone that it is a fifth. This fact that he can get the same knowledge on two different planes does not lead him to question its validity on either. He accepts a certain kind of noise as associated with a vibration ratio of 3:2. But no amount of analysis will ever disclose the nature of the association. This is an analogy to the interaction of the self and antahkarana in the process of perception of the world. The ideas run parallel and they interact, but they do not coincide. Why? Because they are on different levels. In the normal process of knowing, the antahkarana splits itself up into the three: the subject who knows, the object known, and the process of knowing or cognition. The self is seen in the mirror of the antahkarana, and it is a principle of our constitution that the mirror should be a distorting one. We see through a glass darkly. The antahkarana is ever active and assumes various forms or modes except in deep sleep. When its activity is latent in itself, one of its modes is the consciousness of itself, which may be called egohood. The ego commonly confuses itself with the real self. When we say, I am restless, we mean that the antahkarana is restless. But we wrongly transfer the restlessness to our inner self. Herein lies the essential difference between mere introspection and the knowledge of the inner divine self, which comes from knowing about it are on two different planes. When the antahkarana assumes the mode of the doubt or indetermination, it is called mind, in the sense used in the statement, I cannot make up any mind, my mind. The item mind includes resolution, sense perception, desires, and emotions. When the antahkarana has the mode of certainty or determination, it may be called intellect, and including the powers of judgment and reasoning. And when in the mode of reflection and remembrance, it may be called attention. The ego, the mind, and the intellect function only intermittently. Their activity has a birth, growth, and death. An argument, for example, begins with the premises and works through a chain of reasoning to a conclusion. Attention, however, may endure, and this mode of the antahkarana is regarded as the most important because meditation, contemplation, and concentration belong to its province, and these are the activities by which a person uses his antahkarana to seek and find reality. They are the point of the thorn used to extract the other thorn of avidya. The antahkarana is not, however, a purely philosophical concept. It's not an entity invented to meet some logical or formal difficulty like Locke's substance, which was introduced because one could not have ideas in nothing, are the luminiferous either of the 19th century scientists who could not contemplate light waves in nothing. The Antakarana is regarded as a real object by Shankaracharya, which the student can detect by direct experiences. The interaction of the inner self and Antakarana is essential to the functioning of the Antakarana. Shankara does not say, on the one hand, that the Antakarana can know itself, as the materialists openly or tacitly do contend. Nor does he say, on the other hand, that spirit and matter exist in two separate watertight compartments. Both these theories lead the materialist to ludicrous conclusions. The materialist theory, taken in conjunction with the determinist view, which logically accompanies it, is self-stultifying. If the mind is a machine, both the proposition that it is a machine and its consciousness of itself as such a machine are inevitable products of the machine itself, and therefore have no validity. Though it is fair to say that equally they are not necessarily false. The second theory, that spirit and matter exist in watertight compartments, leads to a difficulty that confronted Aristotle. It is difficult to assign appropriate and matter without violating the unity of reality. If spirit influences matter, is its influence a spiritual aspect? If it is a material influence, then spirit must have material properties. Descartes regarded mind as disparate from matter, but to get them together for psychological purposes, he had to invent a fluid which he called animals' spirits. Shankara's approach to this basic problem is quite different. In the first place, there are, in his view, three entities to be accounted for: the pure self, the antakarana, and the body and other matter. The essential interaction was for him between A and B, whereas the Western philosophers have been looking mainly at the interaction of B and C. For him, the apparent incompatibility of the pure spirit or self and the antakarana was not real but only empirical. Ultimately, both of them are, in essence, the non-dual Atman. He says frankly that the self contains the antakarana and the antakarana reflects the self. If this view seems inexplicable, then the relationship between the two aspects of a musical fifth and no more contrary to common sense than such theories as Descartes. On the theory of perception, which is in effect the relation between antakarana and the matter, Shankara had himself worked out any well-established theory, but it may be interesting to set briefly the ideas developed by his school and particularly by Dharmaraja, who lived about 1600 AD, almost the contemporary with Descartes. These views are not a part of Shankara's own teaching, but they show the way the Vedantist mind has worked under his influence. Broadly, the Vedantist view is that the Antakarana streams out of the body through the senses and comes in contact with the object. One part remains within the body, another gets in touch with the sense of object, and a third or model of knowledge connects the two. If the ego is then illuminated by the pure consciousness, a perceptive knowledge arises. Merely directing the sense organs do not in itself cause a perception. The activity of the Antakarana is indispensable. Otherwise, we stare at an object without perceiving it. The mode of the Antakarana and the object are not perceived as two, because both occupy the same space, even as the part and the space within it are located in the same spot. In perception, the object and the Antakarana must be present. This distinguishes perception from memory, which is recollection of past perception. Inference is distinguished from perception in that there is no contact of the Antakarana with the object inferred. For example, in inferring fire from smoke, the Antakarana is in contact with the smoke, and the connection between the smoke and the fire is only recognized from memory. In memory, we have the self associated with the past experience determined by the Antakarana. In recognition, we have perception and the memory of past perceptive experience fused together. The later Vedantins also held that it was necessary for perceived objects to be suitable for being perceived. Virtue and vice are attributes of the Antakarana, but they cannot be perceived. The Vedantins also drew a suitable distinction between perceptions affected through the senses and the perceptions not affected through the senses. Epoch is perceived through the senses of sight, touch, etc. But pleasure and pain are not perceived through the sense organs. But to return, Shankara's own theory of knowledge, the Antakarana, plays an important part in his epistemology. For as we have seen, it is the Antakarana that creates the individuality by an illusory splitting up of the non-dual self into the self and the not self. The self as associated with the Antakarana appears in two aspects. How? When the self as immanent in the Antakarana, the spark divine, the Atman in the deep heart's core of each one of us, and two, the self as the transcendent spirit or Brahman, but conditioned by the operations of the Antakarana. To be brief and also to avoid misunderstanding through misleading translations, let us call these aspects S1 and S2. Relatively to S1, the Antakarana is an attribute, relatively to S2, it is a limitation. According to Shankara, through the body, the senses and the mind carry on their dependence on the conscious self, at owing to non-discrimination, the qualities and the activities of the body, the senses, the mind, etc., are attributed to the self, that is pure existence and pure consciousness. In the same way as blue color is attributed to the sky. One of the difficulties that have bothered Western philosophers is the explanation of this sort of the error. The difficulty is a serious one, because on almost any view, whether common sense or philosophical error seems to enter to a greater or less degree into both perception of events and judgments about them. True, the problem is not so bad for the idealist philosophers, because they maintain that the mind never makes contact with outside reality at all. It merely knows ideas which at most are presentations of what goes on outside. We do not see a table. We merely experience some impressions of brownness, solidity, and coldness, etc., which are really in ourselves. On this view, it is always possible for the mind's judgment on its own ideas to be at fault. But the realist view, according to which the mind is pictured as a searchlight playing on a real object outside ourselves and reporting on what it finds, does not provide for error. Errors are due to physical defects in the Antakarana, such as defective eyes or eyesight due to the jaundice, or similarity explained. Although in this case there is no need to assume the specific intervention of avidya. In all perception and in all human judgment, however, there is always some element of the limitation or error due to false attribution. Dreams are also illusory perceptions. There are not mere memories, for in a dream one should say to oneself, I am talking to a beautiful woman, and not I remember talking to a beautiful woman. The importance of the part of the writings of Shankara and his school that we just reviewed lies in that we can see him going over the same problems that have occupied metaphysical physicians from Aristotle 1,000 years before his time to Whitened over 1,000 years after. Putting the matter at its lowest level, his conclusions point to a solution of these verbal puzzles on the intellectual level, which on the hand is at least not inconsistent with the empirical scientific approach. And on the other is a reflection of the coherent attitude on the spiritual level. Shri Kantaya Kalyana Nidhe Nidhe Dram Shri Venkatnivasaya Srinivasaya Mangalam Mangala Shasana Paripadajar Purogame Sarvaya Chaurve Racharya Satkrutaya Stu Mangalam.